The high plains do not hold you so much as they test you. Wind moves over the sage in slow-muscled currents. Dust rises, hangs, and sifts back down into its own tracks. If you stand still long enough, you'll hear a telegraph wire sing, a horse shake the prairie from its mane, and the low, patient breath of land that prefers quiet men. Into such a country rode a boy from Pennsylvania who would one day be known simply, almost shyly, as the Sundance Kid. He was born Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, and the West took him the way the West takes everyone. One choice, one hard winter, one empty road at a time. By the mid-1880s, when Longabaugh drifted into cattle country, the plains themselves had been through a trial by ice. Old hands still spoke about the winter of '86, '87, the great die-up, when snow locked the grass away and the wind came down like a clean blade. Hundreds of thousands of cattle perished, big outfits folded, fences rose where open range had been a promise instead of a memory. A young rider learned quickly what endurance meant, how to read a sky, how to ration coffee, how to handle a bronc that had seen too much wire and too little feed. The country got lean, and so did the men who kept riding it. Longabaugh was not yet an outlaw in the fashion of the dime novels he likely read as a boy. He was a hand, quiet, competent, useful. He worked where the work was, and the work was vast. Line camps, roundups, the long arithmetic of cattle, miles, and weather. He passed through places that have nearly gone to paper now, brands and bunkhouses you only find in archives. And for a season, he took wages with outfits like the Bayou Ranch in what is now Alberta, one of the largest spreads of its day. That job, like most, was temporary, a fact of the drifting life. The West could make a man restless, and restlessness is cousin to misjudgment. In 1887, near the little town of Sundance, Wyoming, Longabaugh crossed a line he could not uncross. There was a horse, a saddle, and a gun. There was a lawman. There was a courtroom and a sentence that measured not only time served, but a change in the man who served it. He went into jail as Harry Longabaugh and came out with a name that sounded like sunlight, but carried the grit of a lockup, the Sundance Kid. Names stick on the frontier the way burrs stick to a bedroll, and this one, simple, flat, a place pressed into a person, would ride with him further than he knew. After his release, the prairies took him back with that same unsentimental welcome they offer any rider who can sit a saddle till dark. He worked again, and he wandered. Calgary knew him briefly as a saloon partner. Montana saw him as a cowhand who understood horses better than talk. Some historians sketch his drifting years with dotted lines that run north and south of the border. The record is grainy but legible enough to show a pattern forming. A man who could balance in the gray and keep his counsel. Where other men bragged, Sundance listened. Where others crowded the center of campfire light, he kept to the edge and watched the sparks go up and disappear into the dark. That gray widened in the 1890s as the cattle frontier matured into something tighter, more policed, and less forgiving. The telegraph stitched towns together. Rewards fattened. Detectives who learned the country almost as well as cowboys did now rode the rails and the trails both. In such a world, the old hideouts grew more valuable, not less. And in Wyoming, there was one hideout whose name was more landscape than address. Hole in the wall. Imagine a red sandstone escarpment. The red wall, cut by a narrow cleft that opens into a secret basin. Springs, timber, grass, cabins for wintering, approaches that could be watched and defended. Exits like rabbit runs through badlands and broken mesa. An outlaw could winter there and feel, for a while, as if the map had been folded just where he needed it to hide. The hole-in-the-wall gangs were never one gang. That term belongs to headlines. They were a loose company of men not born to the same outfit and not bound by more than need, caution, and, sometimes, respect. In that company, the name Butch Cassidy was spoken in the tone men use for someone they trust to plan and to keep blood off the tally if possible. It was into the orbit of Cassidy that Sundance rode, not as a loud gun, but as a steady one. The partners who would become inseparable in story were, at the start, simply two men who understood that the country offers cover to riders who know it well and move light when the wind is up. If you follow their first trails from the Red Wall out across central Wyoming's open places, you begin to see why escape on the high plains looked almost like a skill, not a miracle. A posse, burdened by numbers, left a ribbon of dust you could spot from a mile off. A pair of riders could slip into a draw and be gone. Water holes dictate routes. So do fences. So do ranches, where a sympathetic cook might trade a hot plate for news. When you live by such arithmetic, the map becomes a second skin. The men who hunted them learned this too, and the country became a board where every move had an answer, some of them fatal as the years ahead would prove. But in the late 1890s, before the big blows fell, there was still room to vanish. The high plains kept their secrets. The winter cabins behind the red wall put a roof over a myth that was still only a set of habits. Men came and went, horses were swapped. Letters, few, deliberate, moved like contraband because a man's handwriting could betray him as surely as his face. And somewhere between those cabins and the little towns along the Union Pacific, Sundance perfected the kind of silence that keeps you alive when the only thing louder than your pulse is a deputy's spurs on a plank sidewalk. In the popular imagination, he is forever looking over a horse's ears at a horizon he intends to beat. In truth, he was often waiting, measuring the space between risk and reward and deciding when to move. Yet the West was closing. You could feel it in the way telegraph keys clicked through the night, in the way newspapers traded stories like cattle brands, in the way big outfits hired detectives whose eyes were trained not on clouds and creek levels, but on faces and aliases. The last country for a writer like Sundance was not always the farthest. Often it was simply the most familiar. Hole in the Wall was a country he understood the way a carpenter understands grain, where the land will split cleanly, where it will fight you, where it will hold. And it would be from that familiarity that a string of decisions followed, some made around a cook fire, some under the iron hiss of a locomotive's breath, that carried his name out of Wyoming and into the pages of every Western right or wrong morality tale printed since. The first of those decisions was simple. Ride with men who could plan, hit hard, and leave no bodies if they could help it. That meant Butch Cassidy and the company that newspapers would christen the Wild Bunch. Stand one last time at the edge of the red wall with him and look out. The grass below is cut by draws like handwriting on rough paper. Far to the south, a whistle lifts and falls. To the north, a storm is building along the mountains. Somewhere, a ranch dog is raising Cain at nothing in particular. The kid shifts in the saddle and turns east, where rails split the country into miles that lawmen can measure and timetables they can trust. He does not know it yet, but the next 9 years will grind his name into legend with dynamite, telegrams, studio portraits, and a woman whose own name will dissolve into rumor. For now, there is only the choice to ride, and the understanding that every escape begins long before the first shot. Out here, it begins with knowing the land and with deciding which trail stays open when the wind comes. Night on the high plains has a sound all its own, a low wire hum, the far-off bark of a coyote, the faint click of beetles in the grass. Toward dawn, another rhythm enters the country like a heartbeat. Steel on steel, a locomotive drawing breath. The timetable calls it the Union Pacific Overland Flyer number 1, running west with a head of steam and the nation's trust inside her cars. Registered mail, express shipments, sometimes a payroll heavy enough to make a safe sit like an anchor on oak planks. Out here, where towns are small and distances run long, the rails are arteries. You choke an artery, you change the body's fate. On that June morning in 1899, riders waited in the dark, where the timberline thinned and the grade eased toward a bridge near Wilcox. A red lantern on the track, a signal any engineer must obey or forfeit his crew to a blind curve. It's not bravery to stop a train in the night, just procedure. When the brakes sang and the pistons sighed themselves still, shadows resolved into men with bandanas high. The air smelled of coal smoke and drying creek mud. Orders came quiet, efficient, the way men speak who know that voice carries farther at dawn. The crew was separated from the cars. The locomotive walked forward like a patient mule, and the world shrank to the railway span and the express car, the steel rib cage guarding the money heart. The men who planned this job preferred powder to blood. Safes in the last decade of the century wore time locks like iron pride. An express messenger could die on top of one and never make it open a minute before it was ready. That left chemistry. They called it giant powder, the West nickname for dynamite. parceled out in sticks that looked almost harmless until the fuse took, and the night breathed twice, once before the blast, once after. First, the bridge. Charges set to bruise the structure and frighten any idea of pursuit. Then the express car, a boxy, stubborn thing with a door that meant to outlast anxious men. The explosion buckled tin and split timbers. Sparks rose and fell like a brief private meteor shower. The messenger lived. So did the crew. When the smoke cleared and the splinters finished falling, the men en masse took what they could carry and left the country to decide what it had heard. The law decided quickly. Telegrams rattled east and west like hail against windows. Train held up near Wilcox. Suspects believed to be the same fraternity that robbed banks and depots from Idaho to New Mexico. Rewards were posted before the dust lay down. Posses formed in towns that had nothing in common but a jail and men willing to ride. For wages, for duty, for a chance to prove they could read sign as well as anyone. In Cheyenne and Rawlins, the talk said Wild Bunch. On ranch porches, it said Cassidy's Boys. In kitchens, it was shorter. Outlaws. What does a pursuit look like on the high plains? Imagine a line of riders shouldering daylight, the four hooves of the lead horses dark with morning dew. Every man carries his own theory of where the outlaws will turn. Every man's horse carries his own opinion of how long a gallop should last. North of Casper, the ground opens into coulees and flats, where a good tracker can find a bent blade of grass and a slip of leather from a cinch and make a day's story out of it. But the hunted had rehearsed this dance. They knew which creeks ran undercut banks for 50 yards, where a rider could lead his horse in water to blur a trail. They knew which cattle gates a friend might leave unchained, and which windmills creak loud enough to drown out the clack of a rifle bolt. Escape isn't luck. It's literacy in a language written by distance and slope. Somewhere in that first rush of miles, as the sun climbed and the wind began to push heat across the sage, shots were traded. Not the Hollywood fusillade, just those ugly, necessary sounds that men remember later, as stains rather than notes. A sheriff from Converse County, Josiah Hazen, rode hard on rumor and sign and paid the dear price men sometimes pay when the line between duty and ambition gets thinner than a horsehair. North of town, in a land of wind-gnawed buttes and fleeting shade, he fell. The air swallowed the echo and gave nothing back but the laboring lungs of horses and the crackle of heat in dry grass. Death on the plains is always personal and always impersonal. A single name whispered over a body in a horizon too wide to take notice. By afternoon, the chase had spread into a fan and weakened, as chases do, under the weight of ink and speculation. Newspaper men wanted villains with first and last names. Railroad detectives wanted serial numbers from singed banknotes. Local ranchers wanted the noise to pass so calves would quit spooking. Pinkerton men took to their ledgers and maps. They wrote down the shape of boot heels and the borrowing habits of liquor store proprietors who changed big bills without too many questions. They followed stories about a bay gelding with a white sock and a rider who wore his hat brim bent low. They kept asking for the same things the West had always hoarded. Details. Meanwhile, the men who had thrown the powder rode the old math. You don't outrun a posse forever. You make it run to the wrong place. And you don't fight a county. You cut across it when it's sleeping and leave it arguing with itself at daybreak. Somewhere between Wilcox and the red ramparts of the hole in the wall, the outlaws made what seems, on paper, like a simple choice and is, in practice, the sum of a dozen small ones. They slipped off the obvious line and took a thread through ground that behaved like a friend. The red wall isn't a wall so much as a verdict, a long, broken sentence of stone pronouncing what comes next. If you know the clefts in the benches, the draws that look blind and aren't, you can pass through that country like a rumor. If you don't, it turns on you like a calf under a rope and throws you where you can't stand. Back on the rails, inspectors walked charred planks and picked up splinters like forensic rosary beads. Powder burns told a story in scorching arcs. The iron belly of the safe, wrinkled and opened like a brutal flower, told another. Somewhere a depot agent counted the first of the losses and wrote them in a hand so careful you could feel the strain in his wrist. Somewhere else, a telegraph key kept time like a nervous heart, sending out descriptions of men whose faces were the right blend of ordinary and unforgettable. Medium height, good seat on a horse, speaks little, rides better than he walks. If the West had a common language, it was the language of men who leave trace and try not to. And what of Sundance himself, the quiet rider with a new name and a long look? Many place him there that night, mask up, hat pulled down, working the edge of the scene where a steady hand is worth more than a loud one. He appears in recollections like a pencil mark, sharp enough to read, light enough to fade if you squint. He didn't invent the method, but he didn't argue with success. Split the train, isolate the express, let the powder talk. Keep the crew alive. Dead men make passes brave and juries eager. Don't linger on a victory. Victory is only the first mile of a long retreat. By evening, the planes had reclaimed their silence with the efficiency of a tide smoothing a footprint. The flyers rolled again. The newspapers took their ink baths and came up shouting. The rewards got bigger. The talk got better. In saloons, men who had spent the night in their own beds described the blast as if they had tucked the fuse beneath the door themselves. In ranch kitchens, women cutting bread shook their heads at the gall of it. The sheer nerve of blowing a car for a satchel of bills that would go cold in a gully for an hour, while the riders watered their horses and listened to the wind. It is an odd truth that boldness pleases even those it robs, as long as the boldness stays far away and wears a mask that will never be removed in their presence. Night came back over the country, and with it the knowledge that something had shifted. The rails felt suddenly fragile. The law felt suddenly late. The outlaws felt the hot breath of consequence on their necks and rode for a place where consequence moved slower. Powder had stood in for a key. Discipline had stood in for rage. A safe lay opened behind them. A bridge groaned under its own insult, and a name was harder to pin than ever. Cassidy for the plans, perhaps, and Sundance for the steady hand. Tomorrow the map would fill with new lines of pursuit. Tomorrow a detective would tack another photograph to a wall and trace, with a thumb, the path he believed they had taken. But for now there was only the steady knock of hooves on summer-hard ground, and the sparing talk of men who knew their work was not to become famous, but to get away. When the high plains want to keep a secret, they do not need to bury it. They need only to open themselves in every direction at once. Men get small in such a space. Dust rises and makes everybody equal for a while. Rider and pursuer, thief and honest man, law and lawless. The riders who had turned the overland flyer into an explosion and a headline thinned into that dust until they were, again, only possibilities. Far back at the bridge and the torn car, the smell of powder lingered. Far ahead in a sandstone cleft that had already kept 1,000 confidences, a lantern might be cupped against the wind, a horse unsaddled, a coffee boiled black enough to keep a man upright through the second half of a long, hard night. And between those distances, the plains, indifferent as ever, went on breathing. The last escape from the high plains is never the last. It is only the next and the next until the country changes or the men do. Dawn again on the rails, and with it the same choreography refined by repetition, a flag in the half-light, a locomotive coaxed forward, a crew eased away from the place where money rides in iron. On April 29, 1900, near Tipton, Wyoming, the method spoke for itself. The men who planned these robberies kept their rules. Limit blood, let powder do the talking, and vanish before the newspapers can agree on the spelling of your name. The blast that opened the Union Pacific's express car sounded like a legal argument answered by thunder. When it cleared, the outlaws did what they always did, took less time than they wanted and more than the law thought possible, then ran their horses into the quiet places where hoofbeats blur into wind. The railroad's timetable staggered. The territory's pride took on a bruise the size of a county. In kitchens and bunkhouses, folks repeated what had become a litany. Same trick, same ghosts, same clean getaway. Only the ghosts were men, and they had names that were hard to pin until a camera helped the country do it. Fort Worth, Texas, year 1900, was a cattle town with a railroad grin, and like all ambitious towns, it loved photographs. A studio window on Main Street displayed a portrait of 5 men in their Sunday iron. Starched collars, derby hats tilting at different angles, watch chains catching the light like small, proud rivers. The sign over the door belonged to a photographer with a steady eye and a businessman's instinct for advertising. The picture was meant to draw customers. It drew lawmen. Once a detective recognized a face or two and spread the word, The image traveled faster than horses. Newspapers printed it, Pinkertons filed it, and the country that had known these riders, mostly by rumor, suddenly had them in a frame. Butch Cassidy leaning slightly as if mid-joke. Sundance still with that guarded calm. Ben Kilpatrick, Will Carver, and the hard-eyed presence of Kid Curry. A studio portrait turned a fraternity into a lineup. Men who'd been described as medium height, good writer, says little, now had cheekbones and tie knots and a way of resting a hand that a barkeep or a bailiff might remember. Photographs, like telegraphs, were closing the frontier in their own way. They made strangers legible. Tipton's explosion and Fort Worth's picture made a duet in the public mind. The newspapers played back a tune whose chorus was "Wild Bunch," and the verses shifted with each day's rumor. Rewards accreted like frost on wire. Express companies sent out circulars that resembled bingo cards. Heights, weights, scars, aliases. The odd habit that can give a man away. Taps the bar twice before drinking, favors his left foot when he mounts. Pinkerton men, who studied human routine the way old cowhands study weather, added each detail to a ledger that smelled of dust and cigar smoke. Over all of it hung the name of James McParland, the detective whose legend had already been inked in the coalfields back east. He had learned long ago that you can beat a gunman with patience, that a map can be a kind of trap if you annotate it with debts, cousins, women who keep confidences, and towns where a man spends too freely after a job. Then came Winnemucca, Nevada desert, a September sun trying to bake sense out of the streets. The First National Bank's doors opened to ordinary commerce. The raid lasted minutes. Men went in, money came out. The sums that made the telegraph wires chatter. $32,000 in change. Felt to the public like confirmation that the same sharp fraternity had expanded its theater. Tradition has pinned the job to Cassidy and Sundance, with a supporting cast out of the Wild Bunch's known circle. Skepticism has kept its hand raised. Witness memory veers easily under stress. Newspapers tend to prefer a famous name to a careful uncertainty, and robbers from across the West read the same headlines everyone else did. If you wanted to disappear in 1900, adopting a whisper of Cassidy's Boys wasn't the worst camouflage. The plaque in Winnemucca tilts one way. Cautious historians hedge another. Truth in the American West is often a three-legged table that can still stand if you set your coffee gently. Whatever the roster in Winnemucca, the result was not in question. Pressure built. The law learned the ground and the habits. Telegraphs threw nets that didn't care about state lines. A hotel ledger could be as dangerous as a deputy's Winchester. A ticket agent with a good memory as fatal as a rifleman. The ironic justice of the Fort Worth portrait kept paying dividends for the prosecution. Wherever those five faces went, someone now recognized the slope of a hat or the shape of a mustache, even if he misnamed the man beneath it. Pinkerton circulars describing one suspect's fine features and another's nervous hands sat on sheriff's desks like secular prayer cards. Stared at, believed in, and dog-eared with use. For the writers themselves, the country shrank. The same hole-in-the-wall passes that had once felt like a promise now felt like rooms in a house under surveillance. You can hide forever only if nobody learns the architecture of your hiding place. But the posses were learning the architecture, how the red wall's clefts relate to the springs, where winter cabins sit under ledges like swallowed words, which night trails cut soundlessly across shale. More than once, a posse's night camp lay within a rifle shot of a cold fire the outlaws had stamped out an hour before. In that kind of proximity, a mistake could cost a life. Discipline, the outlaw virtue nobody brags about, becomes the art that keeps you outside a courtroom. There is a temptation to paint the men riding ahead of the law as insects scurrying before a lantern's cone. It's not accurate, and it robs the story of something harder and truer. The outlaws adapted. They swapped horses with empathy. A tired mount is an argument lost. They bled their pursuers of daylight by deflecting rather than sprinting. Ride across a cattle guard, follow a fence line till it doubles back, borrow a section road for 20 minutes, then step off into the broken ground and let the law gallop past on the loud, easy path. They chose water as a disguise and wind as an ally. They rested when a lesser man would push, because a blown horse tells the next morning's story for you, whether you want it told or not. They were, in short, professionals in a land that was producing professionals to match them. At the same time, the world beyond the prairie horizon intruded more each year. New sheriffs arrived with Eastern schooling. Deputy marshals wore crisp ideas about jurisdiction like new boots. Bankers insured their vaults and timed their routines. Railroad companies standardized responses to holdups, rehearsed crew behavior, made the vulnerability less theatrical. Even saloons, that tolerant parliament of the West, grew cautious. A barkeep might still water the beer and sell the whiskey straight, but he learned to watch for big bills in little towns and for strangers who stand with their backs to windows. The West was not tamed, it was complicated, and complication is often deadlier than courage. And over everything hovered the ruthless, democratic eye of the press. Reporters bought drinks and stories, and a man could find himself famous by breakfast, if fame is the right word for being wanted from the Dakotas to the desert. The Fort Worth 5 photograph, reprinted and thumbed, made certainty feel near even when it wasn't. A woman in a parlor in St. Louis could look at that picture and later swear she'd seen one of those faces on a platform in Kansas. Memory braided to fear masquerading as recollection. Lawmen cherish such leads because you chase what you have. Outlaws despise them for the same reason. Between rumor and pursuit grew a violent ecosystem that fed on timing, on nerves, on how quickly a man could decide to believe what he wanted to be true. So the circle closed, not instantaneously like a trap sprung, but like ice forming over a stock pond, a skim at the edge thickening toward the center. Sundance and Cassidy watched it happen with the kind of attention born of survival. They could keep riding the narrowing maze. One more train, one more bank, one more winter with their backs to red stone, or they could step off the board entirely. Somewhere between Tipton's smoke and Winnemucca's headlines, the logic of escape changed. It no longer meant outrunning a single posse. It meant outrunning a technology, cameras, telegraphs, a nation learning how to coordinate the many against the few. The last escape from the high plains might have to begin at a dock where gulls complain and salt bites the air, far from the creak of saddle leather and the dry whisper of sage. And so, while the law cataloged their habits and newspapers measured them for myth, a different plan hardened. Leave. Not into another county, not even into another territory. Past the end of the rails and over the edge of the map as most Americans understood it. There was talk of a woman who could keep pace with horses and men both, in a port city where tickets are a kind of absolution if you board fast and don't look back. But that is a story for another part. For now, all you need to see is the map shrinking like a wetted hide and two riders studying it in the wavering light of a lantern, understanding that sometimes the boldest ride is the one that takes you off familiar ground, because familiar ground has learned your name. If the high plains had taught the art of vanishing, New York Harbor taught the art of departure. February winds pushed whitecaps through the narrows. Gulls rode the updrafts off a forest of masts and funnels. On the pier, a British steamer huffed like a patient beast. Tickets bore names that fit like borrowed coats, and baggage tags promised nothing but distance. He signed as a variation of Harry A. Place, her surname for his alias, and she as Etta Place, the woman who could sit a side saddle as long as any trail hand and hold a gaze like a level. Those who knew them by other names were far behind, caught in the echo of telegraph keys. Ahead was a blank page so large it felt more like sky than paper. On board, coal smoke braided with salt until clothing kept the smell as a souvenir. Steerage sang with the babble of a dozen countries. The saloon deck clinked with cups and careful English. At the rail, the kid and Etta watched the city fall behind until even the tallest buildings became pencil marks, and then nothing at all. He had left country before, countless line camps and little towns that grew small behind a horse's tail. But a ship's wake draws a more deliberate line. You can follow a rider's track if you read the ground right. You cannot follow a wake once it closes. That too was part of the plan. You could mistake Etta Place for a romantic invention, if not for the way her presence tightens the focus of the record. Pinkerton's circulars, hardly given to poetry, called her striking. Early 20s, fine features, brown hair dressed high, riding as well as a man. There is a picture taken in a studio that confirms what the words only point to. She sits with Sundance as if the world were a parlor, and she were equal to it. calm, composed, unafraid of a lens that turned other outlaws solemn. In a century eager to pose men with six guns and swagger, Etta's most subversive act may have been composure. She was not a moll to be tucked into a caption. She was a partner who shared danger deliberately. When she chose the crossing, she was choosing more than a change of scenery. She was choosing the wager that a new world might let them write new pages faster than the old one could read the last line. The Rio de la Plata received them wide as a prairie and brown as spring runoff. Buenos Aires rose in a low glitter of windows and chimneys, a city where Spanish and Italian ran together in a music city folk called Lunfardo, and where money moved like water if you knew the channels. Porters swarmed. Trunks found carts. A few days later, papers in order, the trio, Butch in his chosen alias, Sundance's place, Etta realer than both, rode the rails far south, past grain towns and windbreaks of Lombardy poplars, past river-choked lowlands, and into a latitude where the sky grows bigger by the mile. The names on the map, Trelew, Gaiman, Esquel, carried Welsh on their tongues, a colony planted decades earlier by chapel folk who wanted their speech to survive oceans. Where the high plains had given the outlaws redstone and sage, Patagonia gave them granite ribs in a wind that never forgot to blow. Near Cholila, a settlement stitched to the foothills of the Andes, they bought or leased land. Accounts vary, the deed books worn thin by time and curiosity, and put up a four-room cabin of squared logs and honest joinery. The photograph survives, a low house under a sky that looks like it has room for every choice a person could make. The men in work shirts and boots, dogs nosing the edges of the frame. They stocked sheep and cattle, bought saddle horses, learned which streams held through late summer and which dried to questions. In the mornings, a rime of frost silvered the grass even when the sun felt generous. At noon, the mountains sat so near they seemed like hands raised to bless the valley, and by dusk their shadows advanced like a second tide. To the kid, the place must have felt like Wyoming with deeper cold and more weather, an honest country that rewarded the same discipline. Keep fences tight, stock watered, tack mended, powder dry. Neighbors were a collage of languages and habits. Welsh families kept tidy gardens and sang hymns that rose pure through thin air. Criollo riders, gauchos whose knives flashed silver at their hips, worked cattle with a quiet pride that needed no translation. Tea in one kitchen became mate in a gourd in another. Bread loaves sat beside tortas fritas, still shining with oil. A ranch is its own grammar, no matter the language. Salt blocks, windbreaks, sore hocks, an eye on the weather. The newcomers listened more than they talked, learned the names of the winds, and paid cash when they could. The gun hands that had once tapped powder from a stick into a crevice now tamped fence posts and scribbled figures for lambing percentages. People who met them later remembered decency and distance in the same breath. Not unfriendly, not inviting questions. A kind of earned privacy. There was peace for a season. Real, not imagined. Etta read by lamplight and learned the faces of stars that sit lower and stranger than the ones that ride over Wyoming. On Sundays, you could hear a hymn from a Welsh chapel sail across the grasslands and lose a few notes to the wind. In winter, hoarfrost on willow twigs made the world look glass-blown and temporary. They branded calves that wore no guilt and walked fence lines that told no stories on the men who tightened them. Against such days, the outlaw's former life looks like a fever dream, and you could forgive them for believing the dream had broken, like a horse finally gentle after months of work. But the world does not stop at a line on a map, and memory does not care about oceans. In 1905, rumors began to run ahead of writers again. A bank in Villa Mercedes felt the sudden loss of a stack of bills. Far to the south, another teller stared at the wrong end of a revolver. Witnesses spoke of foreigners with confident seats and good Spanish. Some historians tie those bold days to the trio. Others untie the knot with care, reminding us how quickly a story recruits the nearest famous name. What cannot be disputed is pressure. Pinkerton men were said to be on the continent. Argentine police began to watch the foreigners who kept to themselves, and there was the old arithmetic of outposts and gossip. A single dinner conversation could move a rumor farther than any horse could. One account passed down like a family Bible and treated with the same mixture of reverence and skepticism has a friendly official, a provincial sheriff or a governor's man, riding out quiet to the cabin and speaking softly over coffee. Váyanse. Mejor ahora. Go now. Better now. Whether the warning came officially or in the careful language of neighbors who had grown fond of the Americans and their money, the message was the same. The country had been generous. The clock had not. You can winter forever only if no one notices the smoke from your chimney. Before the end, there were smaller goodbyes that did not make the papers. A saddle cinch mended for a neighbor and returned with a nod. A lamb doctored with tinctures that smelled like a pharmacy and a garden both. Etta swapping recipes for scones across a fence while her hair tried to escape its pins in the Patagonian wind. These are not the images that usually attend legends, but they are the images that keep people human when legend threatens to turn them into silhouettes. If the cabin offered them a chance to be ordinary, even briefly, it also taught them what ordinary costs. Routine, visibility, the kinds of ties that tug when the time comes to cut loose again. The kid and Cassidy had learned one lesson more thoroughly than any sheriff could. Escape is not merely speed, it is sequence. You plan not the gallop, but the hour before the gallop and the hour after. In late 1906, by most reckonings, Etta Place took her leave of the southern latitudes. Passage north under a name as plain as window glass, a steamer cabin with two thin blankets, a harbor that looked nothing like home and more like safety than either of them wanted to admit. She disappears then, for us, into the fog banks where speculation builds its cities. Some say she returned to teach somewhere, or married under an honest name, or died young under a false one. The only certainty is that she left the men to their work and the men left the cabin to its echo. Without her, the pair felt altered, as if a rider had lost a stirrup and could not quite find it again, no matter how he searched with his toe. They sold out or walked away. Records argue the point the way old men argue weather. And the four-room house kept its shape under a sky that had no opinion on legend. The Welsh neighbors folded the memory of polite Americans into their own histories. Gauchos rode past and nodded at the fence lines those Americans had laid. In the corral dust, you could still make out the print of a small boot near a larger one if you looked in the right light. The photographs, the few that survive, don't tell you the sound the door made when pulled shut the last time. Doors in cold countries click like promises, or like warnings. The men turned north and west again, toward Chile and dryness and the long geometry of borders. They did not say it, because men like that do not speak what cannot help them, but the meaning was clear enough. The last escape from the high plains had only paused in a place that resembled Wyoming the way a mirror resembles a face. It was time to ride again. After the cabin door closed behind them, the men became again what the wind understands best: motion. They edged west through country set with granite ribs and cold rivers, where the Cordillera throws down snow even in months a calendar calls kind. The passes above Nahuel Huapi take their time revealing a way. Lakes lie like silver traps between black forests, and every descent into Chile feels like a decision revisited at each switchback. Behind them, the plain they had tried to fill with ordinary days, lambing tallies, mended fences, tea with Welsh neighbors, flattened into distance. Ahead, a border that had served so often as a hinge now swung open on a darker corridor, where rumor rode faster than any horse and wrote its own dispatches. Somewhere a telegraph key in Buenos Aires clicked out their aliases to a clerk who did not know them and would never see them, and somewhere else a detective traced with a finger the path two Americans might take if they needed to vanish in Spanish. It is comforting to believe that a man can change his name, and therefore his fate, but names are only part of the cargo you carry. The rest is habit. The rest is how you consider a gait, how your hand moves on a rein when the ground goes to marbles, how you measure the time between hoofbeats and a distant shout. For a season after Cholila, they tried to live by different arithmetic, but in 1905 the ledger flipped to the old side. On February 14th in Rio Gallegos, two English-speaking men walked into the Banco de Tarapacá y Argentino and walked out lighter of conscience and heavier of coin. The teller remembered their accents. The wind remembered their dust. The pair sheeted north over the steppe, and the country absorbed their tracks the way a tide will take back a footprint. Was it Cassidy and Sundance? Tradition nods, caution frowns. The bank's loss is a fact. The identities, like heat mirage, waver. Still, the story stuck close enough that Patagonia began to say the Americans had not surrendered the old trade so much as translated it. Whatever the truth in Rio Gallegos, truth's consequences arrived on schedule. The Pinkertons had known about the Colilla spread, winter too hard to make an arrest when it mattered, spring too full of work to move fast. The name written into agency ledgers for their man on the ground, Frank DeMaio, looks on the page like a punctuation mark at the end of an era. He carried photographs. He carried rumors sharpened into leads. He showed faces to clerks in banks and men in consulates and ticket counters where memory sells better than timetables. It did not take a warrant to tighten the rope. It took persistence, and DeMaio possessed it like a man auditioning for his own legend. The governor of the province, Julio Lozana, issued papers whose language was iron, but a sheriff with Welsh on his tongue and neighborliness in his habits, Edward Humphreys, is said to have ridden out quiet to the cabin long before the ink had dried. The story, told and retold until it wears smooth, has him taking coffee at the table and choosing a different law. The frontier variety that says a warning is sometimes justice enough. Go now, in any language, means leave before the door becomes a cell. They did as told. They sold what a man can sell in a hurry, or they walked away depending on which ledger you trust, and made for Bariloche, then a lake steamer named Condor, and then the high cold that forgives a rider's breath because it too is out of breath. In Chile, the Pacific heaves against a coast that teaches ships manners and men humility. Markets spoke Spanish with a local cut to it. Fish scales flashed like coins in the sun, and strangers were measured not by hat brims, but by what they bought twice. There was work to be had and money to be moved. Always money to be moved, by mule over ranges and by rail across hard, treeless flats. Where money moves, men with guns become punctuation, full stops and commas inserted into the sentences of other people's days. In August 1905, a name that fits like a borrowed coat, Frank Boyd, turned up in Antofagasta, a port town too full of heat and argument to be kind to mistakes. What happened next lay buried in local papers until our own century dusted them off. A policeman fell, and the American called Boyd, very likely Longabaugh, walked away on bond tall enough to make your eyes water and vanished like the tide when a storm turns the day sideways. If true, it is the kind of fact that rethreads an old story with a darker fiber. The quiet rider who had avoided killing his way through the American years now tracked a shadow that would not be shrugged off by charm or discipline. By December 19, 1905, the map tightened further. In Villa Mercedes, a town baked flat by sun and edged by rail, the Banco de la Nación Argentina felt the familiar cold of a barrel's eye and the scalpel of command given without seduction. 12,000 pesos changed allegiance in minutes. The newspapers moved quicker than trains. One of the men who printed the legend had his headline set before the teller had caught his breath. Because that is how business is done when myth is profitable. It arrives early and eats facts for lunch. Again, Cassidy and Sundance wear the charge like a mantle. Again, prudence keeps a corner of that cloak folded back. When the country learned to ride by telegraph, it also learned to accuse by telegraph. There are places in the record where you can hear the click of certainty answering the click of doubt as if the keys were an argument. Chased across ranges and salt flats, the two outdistanced names if not headlines. They lived when they could, as men live who intend to last. Small rooms, clean tack, cash folded thrice and kept dry. They studied payroll schedules because across the southern cone the mines beat time the way railroads do in the States. Men die, ore comes up, wages roll out in regular packages with mule strings to carry them and clerks to count them. And in between, in the space where dust and arithmetic meet, rides risk. You can almost hear Cassidy laying out the cadence as if it were a cattle drive, where the money starts, where it pauses for water, where it feels safe, where the trail narrows. Longabaugh listens, as always, the way good partners do, eyes on the map as if it were a sky he means to read for weather. By then, Bolivia had started to shine on their horizon like a low, hard star. Mines there wore names friendly to the tongue, Aramayo, Concordia, but the work was flint, and the pay traveled in compact caravans that looked to a hungry eye like a pattern worth solving. There is a story, told more softly, that after Etta Place sailed north in 1906, the men tried once more to throw in with honest labor. In the central Bolivian Andes, a tin mine called Concordia put them to work, under names shaped for Spanish ears. As guards more than laborers, men whose job was to stand between wages and the desperate arithmetic of the world. If you want to learn how robbers think, hire them to keep your payroll safe. They will teach you the dangers you hadn't yet imagined. If you want to learn how the world thinks of robbers, pay them with a handshake and a promise no court will recognize, and watch how quickly rumor outruns gratitude. The records, scant, stubborn, leave enough to suggest they wore honesty like a shirt that fit better in the morning than at dusk. Cash still moved. Posse talk still drifted up the valleys like smoke that can't find an open sky. Santa Cruz, far to the east, called itself a frontier town and meant it. The roads looked temporary even when they had been there for years, and business hung on nails hammered into boards that had once been boxes for someone else's goods. It is a place a man can start over if he is the kind who can keep a promise to himself for more than a week. It is also a place where a stranger's name echoes longer than his bootsteps. What kept them moving was not only pursuit, it was a closing world. In Wyoming, a man could pick his creek and cut sign into the wind. Here, consulates kept files, bank managers kept lists, vice consuls knew the shapes of favors and how to file the corners off a tricky day. The United States had more eyes in South America than the old dime novels ever guessed, and those eyes had been trained by Pinkerton ledgers to look for the way a hand rests, for the half-smile a man can't help when the plan is good, for the mistakes men make when they are tired and far from anyone who knows their true names. Frank de Mayo did not have to place them with cuffs on a dock to do his work. He had only to make them feel placed. It is a subtle kind of pressure, and it works on proud men quicker than it works on the cowardly, because proud men understand exactly what it means to be pinned to a page. South of Uyuni, the land takes on a pared-bone look, salt and sky wrestling for ownership. Payroll trains out of certain camps change hands to mule strings as the grades steepened and the rails lost their nerve. In such places, a pair of quiet riders can become punctuation again. A question where the road narrows, an exclamation where a canyon throws an echo back, a period where a single adobe hut stands with its door ajar. Word came up the chain that two Yankees were studying the Aramayo routes too closely, and that a mule was missing that should not be missing. Word is the oldest weapon in the West, or in any South that resembles it. It traveled faster than hooves, faster than the thin rails that tied the camps to towns. It traveled at the speed of alarm. The men took rooms where no one asked for names beyond the price of the room, and they laid plans in the brittle, high air where breath is a thing you count. Somewhere an officer named Concha tallied his own men and decided to be ready. Somewhere a mayor with the look of a man used to hearing both sides of a bad story waited for the next knock on his door. None of them knew yet that they were walking toward a small house and a night of shouts cut short, but everyone felt the math changing. The country itself seemed to lean in, as if curious to see whether escape had one more mile in it. In the room where a map lay open on a rough table, Longabaugh touched the inked rivers with a finger and considered how many breaths a man has above 12,000 feet if those breaths have to be taken at a run. Cassidy watched the door the way bluff, kind men do when they have begun to suspect that charm has an expiration date. The wind ratcheted against the shutters. A lantern's ring of light trembled on a wall made of sun-baked clay. If the high plains had taught them how to read distance, the altiplano was now teaching them how to read limits. In the space between plan and dawn lay a silence so complete it felt like snow. Not the storming kind that kills cattle, but the heavy, muffling kind that makes the world hold its breath before something gives. What gave next would pass into the version of history that prides itself on certainty and into the version of legend that trusts the echo more than the shot. For the moment, there were only two men who had ridden far from the red wall, still trying to outpace a story that had learned to run without them. The air in the high desert thins a man's thoughts down to essentials: water, breath, direction. Above 12,000 feet, every step is a bargain with your own lungs. The camps of Bolivia's tin country lay scattered like poker chips on a table tilted toward the sky, and the roads between them were less roads than ragged intentions. Freight rolled where rail dared. Everywhere else, money traveled as it always had, on muleback, with a guard who watched the dust behind him as carefully as the switchbacks ahead. Into that spare arithmetic, two riders entered, quiet as questions. They had ridden west out of rumor and north out of a cabin they had tried to call ordinary life. In the shadow of the Andes, the days were glass bright and the nights cut clean. Men in these parts spoke of Aramayo the way cowboys once spoke of the big outfits. Wages regular as sunrise, ledgers deep as a well. A mule string-bearing payroll is an invitation carved into moving bone. Anyone who's ever watched money cross open country knows the language it speaks. The riders studied the turns and the timing, the places where canyon walls lean together to make a throat, the places where a single shotgun might command more respect than a regiment on a plane. They did not rush. They did not boast. They were not boys anymore, if they had ever been. In the first days of November 1908, a wagon from the Aramayo Franca concern hauled pay toward men whose hands were raw and blackened by tin and dust. Somewhere between a hill stern enough to make a team blow and a wash that had learned every trick a flash flood can play, the Americans showed their colors without raising their voices. The wagon ceased to be a wagon and became a collection of choices. Stand, run, hand it over, and go home with a story that ends with the telling instead of a bullet. The old outlaw rules still held. Favor speed, spare blood where you can, let the money do the traveling now. The riders lifted what they needed and were gone, the scene closing behind them like a door on slow hinges. But the wind carries more than grit. It carried word ahead to San Vicente, a mining camp that crouched in the ribs of a valley and smelled of ore, sweat, and lamp smoke. The town was small enough to keep its own secrets and large enough to lend its men to a posse without crippling the next day's work. The mayor, Cleto Bellet, a man who knew the difference between a loud lie and a soft truth, took it on himself to hear every rumor twice before he believed it once. Soldiers were called. Miners put aside their drills and picked up their rifles with the same practiced hands. An officer, stone-faced, deliberate, measured the distance from plaza to siding, from siding to the mulberry-colored adobe that could be watched on three sides. They waited for night because night in the high cold thins courage as quickly as it thins breath. The riders came in as strangers always do, tired but not sloppy, hungry but not reckless. They rented a hut said to belong to an Aura, or Aurelia, a widow who knew the price of a roof and the cost of being curious. One of the men asked for mule feed in a town where honest miners had no beast to stable, and cash came in sacks, not on hooves. That detail, small as a dropped kernel of corn, told the waiting men more than any speech. The circle tightened until it was not a circle, but a fist. What followed has been told with the simplicity of a telegram and the embroidery of a campfire. A knock, a shout, the crack of a rifle from too close to miss. The women of the town eased their children toward walls and prayed the saints would sort brave from foolish without leaving anyone widowed by mistake. Soldiers took positions behind stacked timbers and poor stone. A miner who had handled dynamite by daylight hugged the earth and learned what it means to fear powder in the dark. Bullets nibbled adobe into dust the color of dried blood. Inside the hut, two men who had made a profession of escaping found there is a kind of room that refuses to be a country, no matter how carefully you measure it. Four walls, one door, a roof that echoes the report of your own gun back into your teeth. The mayor, listening for his own heartbeat so he could tell it from the rifles, later spoke of it as a rough sequence you could count on your fingers. There were 3 screams of desperation, sharp enough to slice the cold, then a shot, then another. The lawmen pushed in at dawn when the light could be trusted, and when it did, they found 2 bodies in a stillness that had the manners of a church. The men were foreign. The faces, unmasked, relaxed at last by death's indifference, could be matched to photographs if a man wanted to believe. There were papers to fill, pockets to search, a mule to be traced. A grateful clerk with neat handwriting wrote what the town agreed it had seen, the saddest kind of certainty. Word crossed the Altiplano and then oceans. In ranch kitchens in Wyoming, hands paused above the morning biscuits. In Fort Worth, men who remembered the studio portrait hung their hats a little lower and wondered if a photograph could be an obituary. In offices where Pinkerton agents filed their victories with the same ceremony they gave their failures, a box was labeled and shelved. The world loves endings. They tidy the shelf and let us say done without looking over our shoulder. The report from San Vicente offered exactly that. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid concluded. But the west, north, or south has never been friendly to tidy. The graves were shallow and the paperwork thinner than the air that covered it. Years later, when science learned new ways to read bone, men came with tools and care to open a plot and make certainty prove itself. The story says the DNA found there bowed to nobody's legend. It matched neither of the outlaws whose names had been hammered into the signboard above the town. Skeptics smiled. Believers shrugged. The town kept its story like a keepsake in a box you only open on holy days. Ask 3 historians and you'll be shown 3 maps, one ending at San Vicente, one slipping the men north under another name, and a later death. One that spreads its hands and admits that certainty is a horse that sometimes won't be saddled. What we can say, without trespass on faith or stubbornness, is that November 1908 marked the last time the names Cassidy and Longabaugh moved across a landscape faster than the papers that chased them. Whether the bodies in that hut were theirs or the town's misfortune, the legend breathed easier after the smoke cleared. It had air to spare in the high country. It learned to walk without the men, just as a well-laid trail will carry riders long after the scout is gone. In that sense, San Vicente was not only a siege, it was a handover. The living story yielded to the told story, and told stories do not run out of breath. What did it feel like inside that room in the last minutes? Eyes meet in the ebb between volleys, and partners who have crossed 2 continents measure the ground left to cover and find there is none. A Colt weighs the same in Bolivia as it does in Wyoming. A 6-gun can be a tool, a habit, a friend, a judge. A man can choose to stop a body from being taken, as if that could stop a name from being taken too. Perhaps they spoke of Etta, the level gaze, the lamplight on her hair, the pages she turned beneath the southern stars. Perhaps they spoke of the red wall, the feel of prairie dust settling in a mustache, the sound a telegraph wire makes when the wind leans on it in March. Perhaps they said nothing at all, trusting 2 shots to say what words cannot. Dawn does what dawn always does. It brings a world back from outline to detail. The town counted its holes and its luck. The soldiers stamped their feet and blew into their hands, trying to thaw their trigger fingers into something like ordinary life. A priest said quick words over 2 men whose names he did not ask because the Almighty can sort aliases better than any court. A team took the bodies away the way teams always do. Steady, useful, without opinion. By noon, the hill held sunlight like a warm coin. By evening, the wind had forgiven the town enough to lift the dust and lay it down again without malice. We returned then to the high plains, not in body, but in the logic of the thing. The last escape from that region was never a single outrun posse or a blind horse pounding across bad ground. It was a chain of decisions, beginning with a kid in Sundance who learned that distance is a craft and that silence is a kind of address. It passed through Wilcox in Tipton, through a studio window in Fort Worth, through a cabin in Cholilla, where tea kettles and lambing percentages tried to civilize 2 restless men. It tapered toward a night in San Vicente, when 4 walls refused to become a country. If the trail ends there, it ends as trails often do, at a waterhole gone dry with hoofprints that fade 5 yards out. If it doesn't, if a man managed to walk away under another name with a heart still hammering, the story is no less true for riding 2 paths at once. Either way, stand at dusk on the Wyoming rim and look east. The wind still comes down the draws with a hand in its pocket. The grass still writes a brief history in a language only writers read. Somewhere a telegraph wire hums to itself, talking to no one in particular. If you listen hard, you might hear hooves a day old and voices longer gone than that. They are not saying much. Men like that rarely did. But what they say will carry. That escape, the last and all the ones before it, is less about speed than knowledge, less about powder than patience, less about law and lawless than the kind of country a man carries inside him long after his horse has been unsaddled. If there is a grave on a high ridge in Bolivia, it does not hold that country. If there isn't, the wind will do the keeping just as well.